You will not last a week here! The taunt cracked the air as rifles dug into her chest. Chains clanged, boots stomped her down, shadows closed in. She exploded. An elbow shattered a skull, iron links whipped across her face. Gunfire sparked stone, dust choked the chamber. A guard's jaw snapped under her knee. Another gagged as her fist crushed his throat. She tore a rifle free, slammed the stock into ribs. Bones cracked, screams broke the smoke. Her strikes came faster, sharper, fire in every motion. In seconds, the wolves around her bled and crawled. The hunted was gone. Only fire remained. Who was she, and how could she dismantle them in a single heartbeat? This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The ambush came with the precision of a trap long prepared. The reconnaissance mission had seemed routine. Quiet ridgelines, empty valleys, a silence that promised nothing more than a survey and a swift return. Yet beneath that calm lay an enemy who had studied every tactic, every pattern, every blind spot. Staff Sergeant Selina Cross moved with her unit through the narrow ravine, eyes tracking the jagged cliffs above them. She had grown up in mountains not unlike these, where the air tasted of iron and stone, and every shift of the wind carried meaning. Still, even her sharpened instincts could not blunt the eruption that followed. The first explosion tore through the slope, sending boulders cascading like a waterfall of stone. Dust consumed the daylight, choking vision and sound alike. Shouts scattered through the haze as soldiers scrambled for cover. Selina was already down, shielding a wounded comrade, her medic's pack pressed against torn flesh when the second blast struck. It was placed not to kill but to divide, driving a wall of rock between her and the rest of the patrol. When the dust settled, she was alone. The silhouettes that emerged from the smoke did not wear American uniforms. They moved with certainty, weapons leveled, faces masked by scarves that left only cold eyes visible. Selina raised her hands, not in surrender but calculation. She had treated enough men under fire to know the difference between a prisoner they wanted alive and a target they meant to erase. These men wanted her breathing. They dragged her up the slope, binding her wrists, forcing her to stumble over loose shale and broken roots. The path wound toward a jagged mouth carved into the cliff face, a hidden entrance to a compound built into the mountain itself. From the outside, it looked like another scar in the rock, but once inside, the truth revealed itself: corridors. Cut by blasting charges, reinforced with concrete, layered with steel doors and the hum of generators. Here ruled Karim Haddad. At 45, Haddad had built his reputation on breaking soldiers in places no satellite could see. He appeared as they shoved her into the command chamber, a lean figure, hair cropped close, eyes sharp as glass shards. His men straightened as he entered, a sign of the authority he carried, not just through fear, but through victories earned in shadow wars. He studied her with the detached curiosity of a man inspecting a specimen. "One soldier," he said in accented English, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner. "One woman. You will not last a week here." The men around him chuckled, the sound low, confident, already convinced of the outcome. Selina met his gaze without a word. Silence could be a weapon too, sharper than defiance. They threw her into a concrete chamber, barely wide enough to stretch across. A steel door clanged shut, plunging her into a darkness broken only by a sliver of light from a vent above. Chains fixed to the wall rattled as she moved. The air was damp, thick with the smell of oil and mildew. Yet even in that suffocating cell, Selina's mind did not yield. She pressed her back against the cold wall, steadying her breath, letting her heart beat. Slow until it matched the rhythm of dripping water somewhere in the dark. Captivity was not new to her bloodline. Her grandfather had taught her what to do when cut off, when every advantage belonged to the enemy. You survived by refusing to let the cage define you. The first hours were spent listening. Boots passed her door in intervals. Keys jingled, voices carried, distorted by concrete, but enough to sense tone, fatigue, arguments. She stored each sound like a medic cataloguing wounds, knowing one day each detail might save a life, most likely her own. On the second day, they brought food, stale bread, water in a dented tin cup. The guard who delivered it barely looked at her, tossing it to the floor before locking the door again. Selina bent, not to eat immediately, but to examine. The cup was scratched, the bread wrapped in rough cloth. Even the smallest scrap might serve later. She chewed slowly, conserving energy, eyes always on the door. By nightfall, she had tested the limits of the chains, the cracks in the floor, the flow of air from the vent. She traced the wall with her fingertips, feeling the subtle vibrations of footsteps above. Somewhere overhead ran another corridor. Mapping it in her mind, she began to build the skeleton of the place that held her. When the third day arrived, so did Karim Haddad. He did not come alone. 2 guards flanked him, rifles angled carelessly, as though certain she was no threat. Haddad stepped inside the cell, folding his hands behind his back. "You are Ranger Medic, yes? Useful. You will tell me much before you break." Selina's lips curved slightly, not a smile but something close, an expression that unsettled more than anger would have. "You think I will break?" she asked quietly. His laugh echoed off the walls. "All of you do. Some in days, some in hours, but all." He leaned close enough that she smelled tobacco on his breath. "And you, 1 week." He left then, the guards slamming the door behind him, but his words, meant to weaken, only carved determination deeper into her. That night, she pressed a fragment of bread crust against the wall, dragging it until it left a faint smear, invisible to any casual glance. She marked another point near the floor, then one above her head. The pattern was meaningless to outsiders, but to her it formed the outline of an escape, a map no one else would understand. She slept little. Sleep was surrender. Instead, she listened to the changing tones of the men outside, to the clatter of weapons, to the distant hum of a generator sputtering at irregular intervals. Every fragment told her something: the shift changes, the weak points, the reliance on machines that could fail. On the 4th sunrise, the guard who came to check her cell leaned too close. His youth showed in the way his rifle strap dangled, in the way his eyes lingered longer than necessary. Selina filed that away, the weak link, the one who believed the prisoner already beaten. She looked down at her wrists, at the iron biting into skin, and breathed deeply. Chains were not the end. Chains were beginning. Because survival was not waiting to be rescued. It was shaping the battlefield, even when that battlefield was 4 walls thick, with concrete and echoing with the laughter of men certain she was powerless. Selina Cross was counting down, not to defeat, to the moment the hunter would be born inside the cage. And far above, in the rocky ridgelines where the wind howled through broken stone, her unit searched in vain, believing her gone. They did not yet know the truth, that the soldier they had lost had already begun to turn her prison into a war zone. The first disappearance would come soon, and when it did, every man in Karim Haddad's fortress would learn what it meant to trap a predator in a den of prey. The mountain fortress seemed unshakable from the outside, thick walls carved from stone. guard posts carved into the rock, floodlights glaring across narrow pathways. Yet inside, the first cracks were already forming, though no one could see them. The prisoner whom Karim Haddad had mocked had begun to slip into the seams of the stronghold, silent and calculating. On the fourth evening, a routine inspection opened the door to change. Mahir, a young fighter who had been assigned to the detention corridor, carried himself with careless confidence. He believed the American soldier was subdued, beaten into compliance. When he unlocked the door, his weapon hung loose across his chest, his gaze wandering to the shadows rather than the figure inside. Selina Cross sat against the wall, shoulders bent forward as though exhaustion had overtaken her. When Mahir stepped closer, she lifted her eyes only slightly, her expression unreadable in the dim light. His mistake was not simply entering, but lowering his guard in a place where vigilance was survival. The strike came swift, precise. She twisted the chain across her wrist, snapping it upward to catch him off balance. Before he could raise his weapon, she drove her shoulder into his midsection, spinning with practiced leverage. He gasped. The air ripped from his lungs. The rifle clattered to the ground. Her hand found the nerve cluster at the base of his neck, a point her grandfather had drilled into her during countless training sessions in the Blue Ridge wilderness. The young man dropped soundlessly, his body collapsing as though strings had been cut. Selina dragged him into the corner, using the ragged blanket from her cot to bind his wrists and silence any sound. She moved with precision, not haste. Panic was for the unprepared. She was neither. From his belt she stripped a knife, a ring of keys, and a small flashlight. Each item was a step closer to reshaping the battlefield. Instead of fleeing, she chose patience. Mahir's absence would not be noticed immediately. Guards often lingered or lost track of time. She slid into the shadows beyond the door, slipping into his patrol route. In the dim corridors, lit only by flickering bulbs strung along concrete beams, she became another shadow among many. Every sense sharpened. The hum of machinery carried differently through each tunnel, letting her gauge distance and direction. The scent of fuel grew stronger near the generator rooms. Faint echoes betrayed intersections before she reached them. To survive here was not to overpower, but to vanish into the environment, to move as if the mountain itself had shaped her path. That night, she mapped 3 corridors and located a stairwell that led upward toward the compound's outer edge. Twice, guards passed within feet of her, unaware of the silent figure pressed into the dark. She marked the rhythm of their patrols, the slackening pace of men convinced no prisoner could threaten them. By the time dawn crept over the peaks, she had returned to her cell, leaving Mahir bound and gagged in a maintenance closet far from discovery. When the morning rotation began and Haddad's men realized one of their own had vanished, confusion erupted. Some assumed desertion, others muttered about betrayal. Selina listened to the shouts echoing through the halls and allowed herself the faintest exhale of satisfaction. The first seed of paranoia had been planted. The next night she acted again. This time her steps carried her toward the communication chamber, a room she had identified by the faint hum of radios and the glow of equipment spilling beneath a reinforced door. 2 guards stood watch outside. Taking them directly was impossible. She needed subtlety. Selina waited in silence until the shift changed. The new pair arrived sluggishly, exchanging brief words before one leaned his rifle against the wall to light a cigarette. That moment was enough. From the darkness of a side corridor, she slipped behind him, her arm snapping across his throat while her free hand dragged the rifle away. He struggled, but her grip was iron, her body positioned perfectly to cut off sound. The second turned at the muffled scuffle, only to find his weapon kicked from his grasp. She drove the butt of the captured rifle into his temple, dropping him instantly. Inside the chamber, the operator sat oblivious, headphones pressed to his ears. She approached silently, lowering him with the precision of someone trained to end life with minimal sound. Within moments, the radios belonged to her. The room was a treasure trove of information. Charts scrawled with coordinates, intercept logs, maps marked with circles and lines. She photographed them with her eyes, committing details to memory, noting especially one plan: a coordinated assault on an American forward base within the week. Hundreds of lives depended on what she carried from this room. She disabled the radios, cutting the wires clean, then scattered the equipment to make the damage appear like sabotage. When the discovery came, it would breed suspicion of insiders, of incompetence, of betrayal within. Fear would fester faster than any wound. Before leaving, she pocketed a small transmitter and a roll of tape. She could not yet signal her allies, but soon, with the right reflection, she would find a way to send word beyond the mountain. The fortress awoke to chaos. Guards shouted in every corridor. Haddad himself stormed through the compound, demanding explanations, his voice slicing through the tension. He refused to believe a captive woman could dismantle his command. Instead, he accused his men of negligence, betrayal, cowardice. The suspicion that blossomed among them was more dangerous than Selina's hands. They began to mistrust one another, watching each step, second-guessing orders. For Selina, this was the beginning of psychological warfare. Each disappearance, each sabotage, each broken chain of command would fracture the enemy from within. She remembered her grandfather's words. Warfare was not always bullets and fire, but fear, the slow erosion of certainty. On the sixth night, she struck again. 2 sentries posted near the perimeter never returned from their route. Their absence spread panic. Rumors hissed through the ranks that a ghost prowled the tunnels, that the American woman had vanished into stone, that the mountain itself betrayed them. Some swore they heard footsteps where no one walked. Others claimed to see shadows where none should be. From her concealed vantage in the maintenance tunnels, Selina listened. Each whispered rumor was another weapon she could wield. Fear was ammunition that never ran dry. Karim Haddad's fury grew. He tightened security, ordered searches of every chamber, yet each sweep came back empty. His men scoured the compound, but Selina was already part of the walls, slipping through gaps they did not know existed. 7 days had not passed, yet already his fortress was crumbling from within. Guards muttered about abandoning posts, communications lay shattered, and the sense of control that had once defined Haddad's rule was unraveling thread by thread. For Selina Cross, captivity was no longer survival. It was conquest in slow motion, the transformation of enemy ground into her own domain. The first guard had disappeared. The communications officer lay silent. The perimeter thinned with each passing night. She was not the one trapped inside this mountain. They were, and soon Karim Haddad would understand that his mistake was not capturing a soldier. It was locking himself inside a fortress with a predator who had decided to hunt. The fortress was no longer a bastion of control. It had become a hive buzzing with suspicion. Every corridor carried raised voices. Every corner echoed with boots slamming against concrete. Yet beneath the noise, a quiet rhythm pulsed, Selina Cross weaving unseen, moving through spaces the enemy never imagined could betray them. On the 7th day of her captivity, Haddad's men argued more than they patrolled. The missing sentries, the silenced operator, the gutted radios, they no longer believed in a single cause. Some blamed deserters, others whispered of infiltration. Haddad himself barked orders with an edge of desperation, his fury born not just from the losses, but from the invisible nature of the threat. He could not fight what he could not find. Selena understood this was the moment to shift from testing to dismantling. Until now, she had been probing defenses, planting terror like seeds. Now she needed proof, evidence of the larger network that had drawn her team into the ambush in the first place. Information mattered more than bodies. Lives beyond this mountain depended on what she carried out. She crept into the upper chambers that night, guided by instinct and the faint scrawls of chalk left on walls by engineers long gone. The tunnels twisted like veins, some abandoned, others sealed by rusting gates. With each step she measured air currents, letting the flow guide her toward passages still in use. At the end of one such corridor, she found a reinforced hatch marked with paint that had begun to peel. It was guarded, but poorly. The men assigned leaned against the wall with fatigue, trading hushed remarks. She watched them through the gap of a vent, memorizing their sequence of glances. When one turned away to adjust his weapon strap, she slid through a maintenance crawl space that bypassed the door entirely. Inside was not another cell block but a planning chamber. Maps covered the walls, topographical sketches of valleys and ridgelines, routes marked in red, arrows pointing toward American positions. Documents lay spread across a long table, folders stamped with symbols she recognized from previous deployments carried, pages filled with coordinates, dates, diagrams of supply lines. Her chest tightened. This was no isolated base. It was a node in a web stretching far beyond these mountains. The scheduled strike on a forward post was only the beginning. Other cells were preparing diversions, supply interdictions, suicide operations targeting convoys. The scale was staggering. She crouched over the documents, her hands moving carefully. She dared not take everything. Missing pages would alert suspicion. Instead, she committed details to memory with the practiced discipline of someone trained to absorb information under duress. Every contour of every map imprinted itself in her thoughts. She traced lines in her mind, connecting regions, identifying the pattern. A soft scrape startled her. The sound of a chair leg dragging across stone. She froze, pressed against the wall. One of Haddad's lieutenants had returned unexpectedly, carrying a lantern that painted the room in orange glow. He muttered to himself, flipping through the folders. Selena's hand tightened around the knife she had stolen days earlier. But striking him here would leave a mess too obvious. She needed subtlety. When he set the lantern down and turned to the shelves, she slid back through the crawl space, breath steady, movements measured. The documents were already locked in her mind. Risking discovery now would serve nothing. Back in the narrow tunnel, she allowed herself a moment to steady her thoughts. The scale of what she had seen meant she could no longer think of her survival alone. Her mission had transformed. She was no longer a prisoner finding ways to endure. She had become the only operative in position to stop a catastrophe. By dawn, whispers spread through the fortress again. Guards complained of hearing footsteps that vanished into walls. Objects moved from one place to another. Haddad cursed them as fools, but beneath his anger lurked something colder, fear that his fortress was bleeding secrets. He doubled the watch on critical rooms, unaware that the breach had already occurred. Selena used their nervous energy against them. As they scoured chambers searching for an intruder, she slipped into areas left unguarded. The kitchen yielded blades and jars of salt she could use for traps. A medical storeroom offered antiseptics and tubing, raw materials for improvised tools. Every night she expanded her reach. Every dawn she returned to the tunnels with more stolen fragments. Her method was not chaos but orchestration. Each small theft, each sudden absence, each misplaced object layered into a symphony of paranoia. The enemy began to doubt each other, arguing over whether the woman they had locked away was still within the walls or had already escaped. The breaking point came when two guards accused one another of negligence. Voices escalated, fists flew, and a rifle discharged accidentally into the ceiling. Dust rained down as shouts filled the corridor. Haddad stormed into the chaos, striking one man with the butt of his pistol. He declared that any who failed again would be executed. Yet even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed unease. He could not shake the sense that the American was still among them, moving unseen. Selina listened from the shadows. Fear was spreading faster than discipline could contain. She knew she had to push harder. That night, she chose a new target. The perimeter defense logs stored in an office overlooking the outer cliffs. The officer responsible for them was meticulous. His records would reveal weaknesses, supply deliveries, blind spots in patrols. If she could seize them, she could not only plan her eventual escape, but also deliver. The American forces a blueprint of the enemy's entire defensive posture. The office door was locked, but the keys she had taken earlier slid into the mechanism with ease. Inside, shelves sagged with binders. She flipped through them, her eyes scanning line after line. Each entry confirmed what she already knew. The guards were overworked, terrified, and breaking under pressure. But one detail caught her attention: shipments scheduled from another cell, due within days. Ammunition, explosives, communications gear. If those supplies arrived, Haddad's base could regain its strength. Selina knew she could not allow that. She began to plan not only how to escape, but how to cripple the fortress so completely that even reinforcements would find ruins, not a stronghold. On her way back, she planted the salt she had taken earlier along a corridor where humidity gathered. Mixed with water, it corroded exposed wiring. Hours later, the lights in that section flickered and died. Guards cursed, fumbling with lanterns. In their frustration, they left entire hallways unmonitored. The fortress that once stood unyielding was crumbling piece by piece, not from bombardment or assault, but from a woman they had dismissed as a captive. Selina returned to her hidden corner of the maintenance tunnels and closed her eyes. Images of the maps, the logs, the diagrams replayed across her mind. She organized them, drew mental connections, identified the critical nodes. The assault on the American base was timed for dawn 2 days from now. If she acted decisively, she could unravel the plan before it began. Haddad paced his command room that evening, his temper barely contained. Reports of vanished men, sabotaged equipment, and inexplicable failures piled higher. He snarled that the American woman was responsible, but his lieutenants dismissed the claim, insisting she could not possibly move so freely. Their doubt stoked his fury, but also left him isolated. The chain of command was fraying. In the darkness of her tunnel, Selina allowed herself one whispered promise: Haddad would not see the end of the week. She did not know yet how the confrontation would come, only that it was inevitable. He had built his empire on fear and brutality. Now fear itself had turned on him, wearing the shape of the very soldier he had thought broken. The next strike would not be subtle sabotage or silent elimination. It would be the beginning of the fortress's collapse, a collapse timed with the knowledge she now carried of the planned assault. Because Selina Cross was no longer surviving, she was preparing for war. The fortress no longer pulsed with confidence. By the fourth night of unrest, it had become a place where silence was feared more than noise. Men jumped at echoes, startled by their own shadows. What had once been a secure redoubt carved into the mountain now resembled a cage of trapped wolves, each turning teeth toward the others. Karim Haddad prowled through his own halls with a face carved in stone. His men watched him with unease, because anger from a commander could be endured, but doubt, that was corrosive. He had been forced to station guards in pairs, not because of tactical need, but because no one trusted themselves alone. Yet even in groups, the fear lingered. Conversations broke off when footsteps approached, weapons twitched at sudden movement, and discipline frayed like old rope. Selina Cross could feel it in the way the corridors vibrated. The fortress was unraveling, and that unraveling was her greatest weapon. That evening, she moved deeper into areas she had not dared to enter before. The medical wing, long ignored in the chaos, became her passage. A cracked door revealed shelves stacked with bandages, vials, syringes, even rudimentary anesthetics. She did not linger. Instead, she gathered a few items that could serve as both medicine and poison. What mattered most was that she left almost everything in place. Missing supplies would spark alarm, but if the bottles remained untouched, no one would notice that two had been drained into her pouch. The compound's inner rhythm had shifted. Haddad's men were restless, disorganized. He tried to impose order, summoning lieutenants into the command room, forcing them to stand rigid while he slammed a hand against maps, demanding explanations for failures. He accused them of incompetence, of betrayal. One by one, their eyes dropped, not in shame, but in concealed resentment. Selina, hidden within a maintenance crawl space overhead, listened as his voice broke from fury into hoarseness. Every word confirmed what she had already measured. The man who had declared she would be broken in a week was himself beginning to fracture. She decided then to move her campaign beyond sabotage. Fear was useful, but fear alone would not bring down Haddad. She needed to turn his own people against him. The chance arrived faster than she expected. Near midnight, two guards patrolled a lower corridor, their voices carrying in frustrated whispers. They argued about the missing sentries, each accusing the other of failing to report movements properly. When one spat on the ground and muttered that perhaps Haddad himself no longer knew what he was doing, Selina leaned closer in the dark. A seed of disloyalty that was more potent than any blade. She struck swiftly. A pebble bounced down the hall, thrown from her position unseen. The guards spun, nerves raw. One barked at the other to check. In that heartbeat of division, Selina slid past them unseen. She left no wound, no body, only distrust. When those two men returned to their unit, suspicion would fester. Her next step was the storage bay. The crates stacked there were marked with stenciled codes she recognized as weapon shipments. She had read of them in the officers' ledgers. Breaking into them would be obvious. Instead, she chose subtler means. She loosened fuel lines, repositioned crates so that supports strained unnaturally. It would not matter tonight or tomorrow, but when weight shifted, when someone leaned too hard, the collapse would come, and with it, chaos. By dawn, another disappearance had already occurred. A sentry vanished from his post outside the upper stairwell. Haddad's men scoured every corner, shouting accusations, dragging suspects into interrogation rooms. Selina watched from a hidden vent, her breathing steady, her mind calm. She had not needed to strike. The fear itself was doing her work for her. The commander's patience shattered. He gathered the garrison in the central chamber, his voice rising to a shout that carried into every hall. He declared that the American was a phantom, a fabrication meant to justify their failures. He swore she was locked away, powerless, waiting only for his order to be executed. But as his words echoed, men shifted uneasily, glancing toward shadows, toward doorways where no one stood. Selina smiled in the dark. Denial was a weapon, but it cut the wrong way. The more he insisted she was harmless, the more his soldiers doubted him. That night she chose her boldest move yet. She entered the generator chamber, where machines rattled and groaned with effort. Guards posted here were exhausted, their eyes half-lidded from heat and fumes. She slipped between pipes, laid her hands on valves, and bled pressure from the system. Not enough to shut everything down, yet just enough to cause sputters, blackouts, sudden plunges into darkness that jolted every man in the fortress awake. When the lights failed, panic surged. Men screamed, weapons fired blindly, sparks ricocheted off walls. In those moments, Selina moved like a current through water, unseen, untraceable. When the lights returned, 2 more guards were missing. By now, Haddad was no longer roaring. He was silent, pacing, eyes sunken. His reputation had been built on control, on mastery of fear. Now fear had become his enemy. His fortress was turning into a trap of his own making. Selina did not rest. She had discovered during her scouting that beneath the compound ran a network of drainage tunnels. Narrow, filthy, but connected. If she could secure them, she would gain unrestricted movement across the entire base. On the 5th day of her hidden war, she descended into them. The stench was suffocating, the stones slick with moss and stagnant water. Yet, the tunnels gave her freedom. She could hear the fortress above like an echo chamber, every footstep magnified, every shout carried through stone. It was in those tunnels she planned her next strike. She would not merely take another guard or cut another line. She would dismantle a cornerstone of Haddad's power. Her chosen target, the munitions stockpile, the storage bay she had weakened days before now awaited collapse. She had taken explosives from a previous raid, but she would not need them here. A small fire, a single spark, would cascade into devastation. Yet she hesitated. Destroying it now would alert the region to what she was doing before she had gathered enough intelligence. Timing mattered more than force, so she marked her path, preparing for the moment when destruction would serve purpose. Meanwhile, Haddad prepared his own counter-move. Humiliated, he summoned his inner circle, declaring that the prisoner must be executed. Yet, none of them volunteered to carry out the order. Too many already believed she was not simply a captive, but a ghost, a curse summoned by their commander's arrogance. One even whispered too loudly that perhaps she had already escaped and was punishing them from outside. Haddad struck him across the face, but the damage was done. Doubt had spread into open rebellion. Selina listened from her tunnel, the voices carrying down. She did not need to strike tonight. Her greatest attack was already unfolding within their minds. Still, she knew this could not last forever. The Americans beyond the mountain remained unaware of the scale of the coming assault. She alone carried the knowledge that an entire network planned to converge on them, and every passing hour brought that attack closer. So she prepared, every item stolen, every tunnel mapped, every weakness planted like kindling. The fire was waiting. When dawn rose again, the fortress was no longer Haddad's, it was hers, and soon the predator he had caged would step into the open, not as a survivor but as executioner. The mountain fortress had become a place of sleepless eyes and trembling hands. Every man inside carried his weapon, as if expecting the walls themselves to attack. What had once been an orderly chain of command now resembled a brittle web, one strand tugged and the whole trembling with panic. Selina Cross felt the shift the way a hunter senses weather before clouds gather. The fortress was already hers in spirit. Now it was time to make it hers in fire. She moved through the drainage tunnels like breath through a reed, counting steps, feeling the stone under her palms. Days of quiet sabotage had given her knowledge of routes the defenders had forgotten existed. She emerged behind a storage bay where crates towered in stacked rows. Their stenciled markings left no doubt. Rifle ammunition, explosives, mortar rounds. Enough to fuel an assault across valleys. Enough to kill hundreds if it left this mountain. The bay smelled of oil and dust. Two men lingered inside, slouched against crates, trading jokes to fight the unease. Selena watched from shadow, patient. When one turned to fetch a lantern, she slid behind him, her blade flashing once across the tendon behind his knee. He collapsed with a muffled cry. The other lunged toward his rifle, but she struck him across the temple, with the hilt of her knife sending him sprawling unconscious. No one shouted. No alarm rang. Only the faint drip of oil on concrete echoed. Selena dragged the bodies behind stacked crates and set to work. She did not need heavy charges. The fortress had already supplied the means for its destruction. She siphoned fuel from a generator canister, drizzled it across wooden lids, and trailed a line of soaked cloth back toward the tunnel. She fixed the fuse with calm hands, as though setting a bandage, her movements precise, deliberate. But fire alone was not enough. She wanted Haddad's men to believe their world was collapsing from within, not by human hand. So she pulled loose supports, shifted heavy crates until they balanced precariously. The bay now stood like a trap, waiting for a whisper to topple it. When the fuse burned low, she slipped into the tunnel and waited. The first blast roared like thunder contained inside stone. Flames tore upward, igniting rows of stacked munitions. The ground heaved, walls cracking with the pressure. The mountain itself seemed to cough smoke and fire. Selena crouched low, shielding her head as shock waves rippled through the drainage corridor. Above, the fortress dissolved into chaos. Men shouted, some fleeing, others running toward the inferno, only to be hurled back by secondary explosions. Ceiling beams collapsed, spraying sparks and dust. For every voice that tried to impose order, 3 more screamed in panic. Selena emerged into the smoke, her face streaked with soot, eyes narrowed against the stinging haze. Around her, men scrambled without direction, silhouettes against firelight. To them, she was another ghost in the chaos. She seized the chance to drive the panic deeper. From the communications bunker she had crippled days earlier, she tore more. Wires and scattered maps, leaving the impression of further sabotage. At every turn, she created signs of an invisible enemy pressing in from all sides. By nightfall, Haddad's fortress had transformed into a battlefield without an opposing army. Explosions echoed long after the flames had consumed the stockpile. What survived was rubble and broken men stumbling through smoke-filled corridors. Karim Haddad stormed through the wreckage, his once commanding voice hoarse with rage. He demanded to know who had allowed such failure. No answer came, only lowered heads, eyes filled with something worse than fear, doubt in him. Selena, watching from a high vent, saw the moment authority slipped from his grasp. He struck one of his officers, shouting accusations, but the man did not cower. He stared back, lip bleeding, expression flat. The chain that bound leader and follower had cracked. Selena retreated into the tunnels, her pulse steady despite the destruction she had unleashed. The fortress was broken, but her mission was not finished. She still carried the burden of intelligence burned into her memory, the wider network, the planned assault, the threat stretching far beyond these walls. Destroying Haddad's stockpile was victory, but only if she lived to deliver what she knew. She settled into a hidden alcove deep underground, listening as the fortress groaned like a wounded beast above. Smoke seeped through cracks, carrying the acrid scent of burned powder. She allowed herself one breath of grim satisfaction, then pushed it aside. Complacency was death. For the enemy, the nightmare had only begun. Some men muttered of leaving, of desertion. Others accused comrades of betrayal. Hadad tried to rally them with promises of reinforcements, but his words rang hollow in the haze of fire. The fortress was no longer a place of control. It was a ruin haunted by whispers. Selena knew the time was close. Soon she would step out from shadow and strike directly at the head of the serpent. But tonight, the mountain itself had carried her message. The hunter was no longer bound. And in the ashes of their arsenal, Hadad's soldiers finally understood that the woman they had mocked as weak had transformed their stronghold into a tomb. The mountain roared for hours after the blast, coughing smoke through fissures that split the stone. By the time the last echoes faded, the stronghold was no longer a fortress. It was a labyrinth of shattered beams, collapsed passages, and men stumbling half-blind through choking haze. The defenders had no enemy at the gates, yet they fought shadows, terrified of a hand they could never catch. Selena Cross had watched long enough. Fire had done its part, but flames alone could not finish what she had begun. Hadad still breathed, and as long as his voice carried inside these broken walls, men would cling to the illusion of command, to end the threat. Not only here, but across the valleys beyond, she had to cut off the head. From her alcove, she began her final advance. She carried only what she needed: a knife sharpened on stone, a scavenged sidearm with 2 magazines, and the transmitter she had ripped from the comms room, now reassembled into a beacon. Its signal was weak, but it whispered coordinates into the ether. She did not wait for rescue. She prepared for the confrontation she knew was inevitable. The central chamber lay ahead, once the heart of the compound. Now it resembled a mausoleum, its banners torn by the blast, its floor littered with shattered glass and scattered papers. Hadad had withdrawn here, surrounded by the remnants of his guard. They stood tense, weapons twitching at every sound. Fear sat heavy on their shoulders, and the man they had followed for years looked less a commander than a trapped animal. Selena moved with the patience of a predator closing on wounded prey. She followed the drainage tunnels until they rose beneath the command level. She pushed aside a rusted grate and emerged into the darkened hall. The corridor carried voices forward, muffled but clear enough to follow. Hadad was speaking. His tone lacked the thunder that had once cowed his men. Now it was raw, edged with desperation. "They are ghosts you chase," he barked. "An intruder cannot survive in these walls. You fail because you imagine her everywhere." One of his lieutenants answered with bitterness, too low for her to catch all the words. But the tone was enough. Defiance. The fabric of loyalty was in tatters. Selena advanced. She reached the command chamber's threshold and crouched low, peering through the splintered frame. Hadad stood at the table, fists pressing into scattered documents. His men flanked him, their eyes hollow, darting at every flicker of shadow. She saw what fear had done, how exhaustion bent their backs, how suspicion drew their hands too close to triggers. A distraction would finish them. Selena loosened a fragment of rubble from the wall and tossed it into a far corridor. The clatter rang like a gunshot. Half the guards swung around, shouting, weapons raised toward nothing. That was her moment. She stepped inside, knife in one hand, pistol in the other. Her figure cut through smoke and ash like a vision born from their nightmares. The first man to see her froze, lips parting in disbelief. By the time his mind caught up, the knife was already across his throat. The second raised his weapon, but her sidearm coughed twice, and he crumpled beside the command table. Chaos ignited. Selena moved like current through water, using their panic against them. Each time they fired, they struck walls, shadows, even comrades. She stayed low, swift, never in one place long enough to be cornered. By the time the chamber fell silent, only Haddad remained upright, his pistol shaking in his hand. He looked nothing like the man who had promised to break her. His hair was matted with dust, his eyes bloodshot, his chest heaving. But there was still danger in him, still the cunning that had built this network. "You," he hissed. "One soldier, and you think you have won. Do you know how many I command beyond these mountains? Do you know how many will rise when I am gone?" Selena advanced slowly, pistol raised, but her voice steady. "I know enough to end it before they move." His laugh cracked into the air, hollow and brittle. "They told me you were a medic, a healer, yet you come here to kill." She tightened her grip. "Sometimes saving lives means taking one." For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the groan of burning beams above. Then Haddad lunged, raising his pistol. The shot rang, striking stone inches from her. She fired back, one clean round into his chest. His body staggered, his weapon clattering across the floor. He gasped once, eyes wide with the realization of defeat before collapsing against the table strewn with maps of a war that would never come. Selena approached, kicking his pistol away. His breathing faltered, the fight leaving him in ragged size. She stood over him, neither gloating nor trembling. It was simply finished. The fortress around her moaned as if sharing his death. Men who remained fled into tunnels, leaving weapons behind. Without Haddad, there was no command, no reason to stay. The stronghold that had once threatened valleys and villages had become a grave. Selena holstered her weapon and pulled the transmitter from her pouch. She adjusted the dial, set it on the table beside his still body, and let it send its faint signal into the night sky. Reinforcements would come eventually, guided by that whisper. They would find proof of everything: the destroyed stockpile, the captured maps, the lifeless commander. But her mission was more than evidence. It was survival transformed into victory. She sank into a chair, body aching from sleepless nights, from the weight of constant vigilance. She closed her eyes only briefly, letting the silence wash over her. When she opened them again, dawn was breaking through cracks in the mountain, shafts of light piercing the smoke. One soldier had walked into captivity. A week later, she walked out with an enemy network in ruins. And in the hollow chamber where Karim Haddad had once ruled, Selena Cross finally allowed herself to breathe, not as a prisoner, not as prey, but as the hunter who had ended the hunt. The mountain air was sharp when Selena Cross finally stepped into the open. After days buried in smoke and shadow, the horizon struck her like a forgotten memory. Snow. Dusted ridges stretched in jagged lines, the early sun bleeding across their peaks. She had emerged from the drainage tunnel, carrying nothing but the essentials, the pistol still warm from her final confrontation, the transmitter blinking faintly in her pack, and the determination carved into her bones. Behind her, the stronghold smoldered. Columns of black smoke twisted upward, painting the pale sky with scars. What had once been a sanctuary for fighters was now a ruin marked by silence, broken only by the groan of collapsed beams and the occasional detonation of leftover munitions igniting in the fire. She didn't glance back long. A predator never lingers on what's already finished. Her boots crunched on gravel as she began the climb toward higher ground. She needed to reach a ridge wide enough for extraction if the signal she had activated managed to cut through interference. The path upward was steep, each step grinding against stone and loose shale. Muscles burned, lungs drew in air laced with smoke and frost, but fatigue no longer concerned her. The mission had shifted beyond her survival. It was about carrying intelligence that could prevent an avalanche of blood. She paused on a ledge to scan the valley below. What remained of Haddad's men scattered like ants from a burning nest. Some fled into gullies, weapons discarded. Others knelt among the wreckage, dazed, waiting for orders that would never come. None looked upward. None imagined the woman they had once jeered at now moved above them. Free, Selina pressed onward, navigating switchbacks hidden beneath pine growth. She could feel the weight of exhaustion tugging at her limbs, but adrenaline kept her sharp. Her mind replayed the maps she had studied in silence, the arrows pointing toward American positions, the dates scrawled in thick ink. Every detail was carved deep enough she feared she'd never erase them. As midday climbed, she found refuge in a hollow beneath an outcrop. From here, she surveyed the valley floor where the fortress entrance had been carved. The black smoke acted like a signal flare visible for miles. Reinforcements loyal to Haddad might interpret it as disaster or rallying call. Either way, she couldn't linger too long. She unwrapped a strip of cloth taken from the storeroom and pressed it against her arm, where days of strain had left bruises blooming under her skin. The sting was nothing compared to what she had endured inside, yet tending to it reminded her of balance, the healer's instinct alongside the fighter's resolve. As the sun slid west, faint static crackled from the transmitter. A sound so small, yet it carved relief through her chest. The device had pierced the veil. Whoever intercepted it would know coordinates, would send eyes skyward, but she couldn't depend solely on hope. She prepared a marker, using a shard of mirror scavenged from the compound. She angled it to catch the light, flashing signals into the sky at intervals. A primitive beacon, but sometimes the simplest tools cut deepest. When dusk approached, she heard distant rotors. At first she thought it a trick of wind curling between peaks, but the rhythm steadied, mechanical, undeniable. She crouched low, heart pounding with the steady beat of blades approaching. Rising smoke had served as unintentional guidance, a black column pointing to her location. A shadow passed across the ridge. The helicopter banked, its side doors yawning open, gunners scanning the terrain. Selina rose from cover, lifting both arms wide. For a heartbeat, she feared the crew would mistake her for hostile. Then one gunner raised a hand in acknowledgement, and the birds swung in her direction. The downdraft hit like a wall, whipping her braid against her cheek, throwing dust into her eyes. She shielded her face and pushed forward until the skids brushed rock. A crewman leaned out, shouting over the thunder of engines, reaching for her. She grabbed his wrist, muscles straining, and hauled herself into the bay. Inside, the contrast overwhelmed her. Clean gear, disciplined movements. The familiar smell of fuel and metal that belonged to her world. The crewman shouted her name, confirmation that her signal had reached them. She slumped against the seat, not in surrender, but in release. The mission had shifted from solitary endurance to shared momentum. Below, the ruins of Haddad's empire receded. Flames still licked the sky, smoke curling in long fingers. From above, the devastation was total. The compound that had once hidden beneath the mountain was nothing more than shattered stone and flickering embers. Yet her work was not simply destruction. She reached into her pack and handed over a bundle of salvaged files, maps, coordinates, coded lists she had risked her life to capture. The crewman's eyes widened as he glimpsed the contents. "Command will want this immediately," he yelled over the rotors. She nodded, too drained for words, but knowing the meaning. Lives saved. Ambushes prevented. Chaos dismantled before it could spread. The helicopter banked toward friendly lines. Selina gazed out the open door, wind tearing at her hair, the mountains stretching endless in twilight. Each ridge seemed etched with memory, the ambush, the cell, the tunnels, the fire. For a week, she had lived inside those jagged walls, fighting without rest, becoming the nightmare of every man who had mocked her. Now she left them behind, not as scars, but as proof. She closed her eyes briefly and heard again her grandfather's gravel voice teaching in the woods. Survival isn't winning. Victory is when the enemy realizes you were never prey at all. The words settled into her like an oath renewed. When the helicopter touched down at a forward base hours later, floodlights cut through the night, soldiers swarming to meet them. The crew guided her down the ramp, and officers moved forward to take custody of the documents. Voices buzzed around her. Astonishment, questions, praise, but she barely listened. What mattered was simple. The network had been dismantled before it could strike. A major approached, disbelief plain in his eyes as he rifled through the intelligence. "You did this alone?" he asked. Selina adjusted the strap of her pack, shoulders squared despite fatigue. "I did what needed to be done," she answered. "No more, no less." As medics ushered her toward a tent, she turned once to look back at the helicopter. Its blade still winding down, its metal gleaming under harsh light. That machine had carried her out of the jaws of death. Yet she knew the true escape had been forged days earlier, when she refused to let captivity define her. Inside the tent, under the hum of generators, she sat quietly while doctors checked her vitals. Their hands prodded and measured, but she hardly noticed. Her mind remained fixed on the ridges. She could almost hear the fortress crumbling still, its echoes chasing her into the present. The officer reappeared, documents clutched tight. "This," he said, voice heavy, "changes everything. You may have prevented a massacre." Selina met his gaze. Her expression gave nothing away, but her silence carried weight. Outside, dawn crept over the horizon once more, touching the mountains with gold. The nightmare in the stone heart of those peaks had ended, but the lesson would echo. Far longer, one soldier, underestimated, had transformed captivity into conquest. And as she rose to leave the tent, still sore yet unbowed, she understood that her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to every fighter who had ever been told they would break, only to rise harder, sharper, unshakable. The forward operating base buzzed like a hive when Selina Cross was escorted through its gates. Helicopter blades still hummed behind her, but now the sound was swallowed by shouts, orders, and the metallic clatter of soldiers rushing to unload equipment. The night had burned away, and with the dawn came the weight of what she carried, intelligence salvaged from a stronghold that no longer existed. Inside a briefing tent, maps covered every surface. Radios hissed with static as operators relayed updates from units scattered across valleys. A colonel stood at the head of the table, expression hard, though his eyes betrayed disbelief as he sifted through the files Selina had pulled from the mountain. Diagrams of supply lines, lists of collaborators, schedules of coordinated attacks. It was all there, proof that an operation of devastating scale had been building in silence. "You realize what you've done?" the colonel asked, voice low but taut. "You dismantled an entire network's momentum, alone." Selina didn't answer with bravado. She simply leaned back in her chair, shoulders squared though her body begged for rest. I stopped what I could. That's all that matters. Her words silenced the tent. The officers exchanged glances, each weighing what her quiet declaration meant. To them, she wasn't just a survivor. She was evidence that one soldier's will could change the course of a campaign. While strategists pored over documents, Selina was led to medical. The staff worked efficiently, noting bruises, burns, and the rawness of muscles pushed beyond exhaustion. She endured their prodding without complaint, her mind drifting not to her own body, but to the faces of the men she had outmaneuvered. The fortress, now buried in fire. She had ended their command, yet in her thoughts they lingered, not as specters of guilt, but as reminders of what arrogance had cost them. By the second day back, her name spread across the base like wildfire. Soldiers she had never met approached with questions, some hushed, others bold. They wanted to know how she'd evaded capture so long, how she had navigated tunnels unseen, how she had turned confinement into a campaign. She offered little. Details belonged in reports, not in campfire tales. Still, her silence only fed the myth. The debrief stretched for hours. Major Whitaker, sent by higher command, grilled her on each decision. "Why didn't you escape when you first took a weapon?" he pressed. Selina folded her hands calmly. "Leaving would have saved me. Staying ended them, and ending them stopped the attack." He sat back, exhaling through his nose. He couldn't argue with results. For days, planes ferried intelligence out of the valley. Drone strikes followed, guided by coordinates she'd memorized. Reports flowed back confirming what she already knew. Terrorist cells scattered, cut off from supply and communication. Planned assaults dissolved before they began. At the same time, whispers of her defiance reached beyond military circles. News bulletins spoke of a medic captured behind enemy lines who had returned, not only alive but carrying the downfall of an entire network. Families of soldiers who might have died in the planned offensives wrote letters of thanks. She read only one before setting the rest aside. Praise meant little compared to the memory of smoke curling through stone, the way fear had hollowed her enemies long before she struck them. On the 6th day at the base, she was summoned to a hangar converted into an assembly hall. Rows of soldiers stood at attention. Flags draped the walls. A brigadier general stepped forward, a small box in his hand. "Staff Sergeant Selina Cross," his voice boomed, "your actions in hostile territory saved countless lives. You did not simply survive captivity, you dismantled the enemy from within, crippled their leadership, and ensured the safety of your comrades. In recognition, you are hereby promoted to Sergeant First Class." Applause erupted. Selina stood steady, her expression composed, though a flicker of surprise crossed her features as the insignia was pinned to her uniform. The clapping was not only respect, it was relief, admiration, awe. Many in that hangar had faced death. Few had walked into it willingly and come back carrying victory. When the ceremony ended, soldiers approached in waves. Some shook her hand, others simply nodded with reverence. She accepted their gestures with quiet humility, her mind still half in the mountains, where victory had tasted of smoke and ash. That night she walked alone to the edge of the base, where the desert stretched into endless dark. Stars burned sharp above her, unmarred by city light. She let the silence settle, breathing deeply for the first time in days. She thought of her grandmother's lessons, how to move without disturbing earth, how to see what others missed in the pattern of wind and stone. She thought of her grandfather's harsh drills, the way he had forced her to endure. Exhaustion, until her mind learned that endurance was a weapon in itself. In the mountain, both voices had guided her. They would guide her still. Weeks later, back in a secure compound further west, Selena was assigned a new role, not on the front line, but as instructor. Recruits gathered to hear her speak, notebooks open, eyes wide. She did not tell them myths. She told them truths, how hunger gnaws at judgment, how silence can crush or save, how fear in an enemy is a resource more valuable than ammunition. She paced in front of them, her presence calm but commanding. You don't need the biggest weapon, she told them. You need patience. You need to see before you strike. And you need to understand that captivity is not the end. It can be the beginning, if you decide it is. The room listened in silence, absorbing each word as if it were doctrine. Afterward, one young soldier approached nervously. "Sergeant, do you ever regret not escaping earlier? You could have spared yourself." Selena regarded him for a long moment, then answered with quiet certainty, "If I had only thought of myself, many more would be dead. Sometimes the hardest path is the only path worth taking." Her reputation grew not just as a fighter, but as a teacher. Men and women left her sessions with new resolve, understanding that survival was more than endurance. It was turning disadvantage into opportunity, weakness into weapon. The operation she had prevented was studied at academies. Her campaign inside the fortress was dissected in manuals, labeled a case study in unconventional warfare. Yet Selena herself avoided the spotlight. She declined interviews, ignored requests for public appearances. She returned instead to training fields, to recruits who would carry lessons into future battles. For her, the war in the mountain was not a story to tell, but a truth to pass on. That one soldier underestimated could alter the course of a conflict. Late one evening, months after the ruins of her dad's compound had been swallowed, by silence she walked the perimeter of a quiet training ground. The air smelled of dust and sage. A cadet jogging past saluted sharply, eyes filled with admiration. She nodded in return, her thoughts distant. Captivity had not broken her, it had revealed her. And in revealing her, it had reshaped the battlefield far beyond 1 week of struggle. She paused, staring at the horizon where mountains loomed faint against the fading sky. For a moment she swore she heard again the crack of collapsing stone, the whisper of her grandfather's voice. Then she turned back toward the barracks, steps firm, ready for the next chapter. Because for Selena Cross, survival was never enough. Victory meant ensuring no one else would walk unprepared into the darkness she had endured, and proving that, even when caged, a warrior could choose to be the hunter. The weeks after Selena Cross left the mountain felt strangely quiet. The noise of collapsing stone, of rifles cracking in narrow corridors, of fire ripping through munitions bays, all of it belonged to a world that seemed almost unreal once she stood again under the sterile lights of a command tent. Yet the consequences of that week echoed everywhere she turned. Across briefing tables, senior officers dissected her every move. They spoke not in awe but in analysis, piecing together how a single soldier had unraveled a network that entire battalions had struggled to penetrate. They called it unconventional warfare. She thought of it more simply, refusing to surrender. Word of her actions filtered through the ranks with speed faster than radio waves. Veterans muttered about the woman who had turned captivity into conquest. Recruits treated her name like a mantra whispered during grueling drills. Commanders invoked her story as proof that adaptability outweighed numbers. Selena herself avoided the noise. She took no pride in being transformed into a symbol. Each time she heard her name spoken as legend, she remembered the faces of frightened men chasing phantoms through smoke-filled corridors. She had not defeated an army through brute force. She had broken them with patience, with fear, with precision. That distinction mattered. Back at the training compound, her role shifted fully into instruction. She stood before groups of soldiers barely out of adolescence, their uniforms stiff with newness, their eyes wide. To them, she was proof of possibility. She spoke without flourish, teaching them not stories but survival. How to read a landscape, how to move unnoticed, how to let silence speak louder than bullets. Strength, she told them, isn't about muscle. It's about knowing when to be still and when to strike. Your enemy might have numbers, they might have weapons, but if you learn to think 3 steps ahead, their advantage becomes their weakness. Her words carved deep. In the field, recruits practiced moving through forest without snapping twigs, practiced listening to wind shifts, practiced staying awake long enough to hear patterns others missed. She walked among them quietly, correcting posture, reminding them that observation was as critical as firepower. At night, when the fields grew still, Selina sometimes walked alone. The stars stretched unbroken across the desert, clear and cold. She let the air wash over her, remembering the sting of smoke, the press of stone, the hum of a fortress collapsing from within. She carried those nights not as nightmares, but as compass points. Lessons burned into her bones. Months passed. Reports confirmed the ripple effect of her campaign. Cells once emboldened by Haddad's command splintered. Some fled deeper into remote valleys, others fought among themselves, scrambling for leadership. What might have been a coordinated offensive disintegrated into scattered violence easily, dismantled by strike teams now armed with the intelligence Selina had carried back. One evening she was summoned to headquarters once more. A general she had never met before awaited her, uniform crisp, eyes sharp. He held a folder thick with after-action reports. "Sergeant First Class Cross," he said, "your operation has altered the course of this theater. But more than that, you've given us a model. What you did alone has become doctrine. Our soldiers are being trained using your tactics." Selina inclined her head. She did not answer with pride. Her silence was acknowledgement enough. The general studied her a moment longer. "Most soldiers come back from captivity broken. You came back stronger." "Why?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Because they mistook me for prey, and when you're underestimated, you have freedom to become something they can't predict." He nodded slowly, as though the simplicity of her words carried more weight than any lecture. After he left, she sat in the empty room, staring at the folder left on the table. Pages filled with charts and analysis. Diagrams of ambushes prevented, convoys saved, hundreds of lives preserved because she had refused to yield in a concrete cell. For the first time, the scale of it struck her, not as glory, but as responsibility. Her promotion brought new duties. She was asked to travel between bases, to speak with units preparing for deployment. Some wanted stories. She gave them tools. She described how to turn a rag into a map, how to turn scraps into distraction, how to outlast fatigue until opportunity emerged. Soldiers scribbled notes furiously, though her lessons were not formulas. They were mindsets. "You can't script survival," she told them. "You can only prepare yourself to bend without breaking." One afternoon, she stood before a class of special operations candidates, men hardened by years of service. Even they listened intently as she explained the art of deception, how to let an enemy believe you are trapped while you position yourself for the strike. One of them raised his hand and asked, Do you think anyone else could have done what you did? Selina paused. Her eyes swept the room. Anyone can, she said at last, but only if they accept that fear is not the end. It's the beginning of control. Her answer settled over the room like iron. Outside the classroom, officers spoke of her future. Some wanted her on high-level missions. Others argued her skills were more valuable as teacher than fighter. Selina herself made no demands. She knew battles would come whether she sought them or not. For now, shaping others mattered more. Still, quiet moments returned her to the mountain. She could not erase the memory of walking through smoke while men screamed unseen, of dragging herself through tunnels with a knife in one hand and hope in the other. She did not wish to erase it. That crucible had carved her into who she was now. Letters continued to arrive. Families wrote of sons and daughters saved by intelligence she had brought back. Some called her a guardian, others a ghost. She read few, but each reminded her that her choices had stretched far beyond her own. Survival. 6 months after her extraction, she received a final call to headquarters. This time not for debrief or instruction, but recognition. A ceremony was held in a sunlit courtyard, flags snapping in the breeze. Senior commanders stood beside younger soldiers, all gathered to witness. A citation was read aloud for valor beyond duty, for ingenuity under captivity, for transforming isolation into victory. Medals glinted under the sun as they were pinned to her chest. Cameras clicked, though she did not smile. She stood tall, steady, letting the weight of the moment rest on her shoulders without bowing. When it ended, applause followed her out of the courtyard. She slipped away quickly, preferring the quiet of the barracks. There, away from eyes and cameras, she sat alone and let the silence fill her. She thought again of her grandfather's words, the ones that had shaped her as a child in the mountains. Never wait for rescue. Become your own. In the fortress, those words had ceased to be memory. They had become reality. That night, she lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. She knew wars would not end with one campaign. She knew enemies would rise again, new names, new banners. But she also knew that in the stories whispered through ranks, her week in, the mountain would remind others that surrender was never the only option. The hunter she had become in captivity would live on in every soldier who learned from her. And as dawn broke once more across the desert, Selina Cross rose with it, not as a survivor defined by what she had endured, but as a warrior defined by what she had chosen to do with it. Because sometimes victory is not measured in territory gained or enemies killed. Sometimes it is measured in the moment one soldier, underestimated and confined, proves that the spirit cannot be shackled. Selina's story would be studied in classrooms, repeated in training grounds, remembered in silence by those who fought. But for her, it remained simple. She had refused to break, and in doing so she had changed the shape of a war. They thought captivity would silence her. They believed that walls of concrete, chains on her wrists, and the command of a man who built an empire on fear would be enough to shatter her spirit. But Selina Cross proved them wrong. She walked into the mountain as a prisoner and walked out as the architect of its collapse. Her story is not only about destruction, it's about transformation. In the dark, she discovered that weakness could become weapon, and silence could be louder than gunfire. She taught us that survival is more than endurance. It's the ability to turn captivity into opportunity, to make every moment inside enemy lines a step toward victory. One soldier, underestimated and dismissed, dismantled a network that had threatened to drown entire valleys in fire. She carried intelligence across broken stone, held it through exhaustion, and returned not just alive but triumphant. Because of her, countless soldiers who would have been caught in ambushes instead returned home. Because of her, the plans of a ruthless commander were reduced to ash. But what makes Selina's story resonate is not only the scale of her triumph, it is the quiet truth behind it. She was not superhuman. She bled, she staggered, she carried fear in her chest, yet she refused to bow to it. That choice is what turned her into legend. As you listen to her journey, ask yourself, how many times have you been told you would break? How many times has someone underestimated your strength? Maybe you've stood alone, facing odds that seemed impossible. Maybe you've been cornered, left with nothing but your will. Selina reminds us that those moments are not the end. They are the beginning of discovery, of what you can truly endure, of how far you can push when surrender feels like the only option. For the soldiers who train under her now, the lesson is clear. Battles are not only fought with bullets, but with the mind, with the heart, and with the refusal to be defeated. And for the rest of us, her weak in enemy hands is more than a military tale. It's a human truth. Strength is not the absence of fear. Strength is what you choose to do with it. This is Veteran Biker, where we honor the quiet warriors, the underestimated fighters, the men and women who carry weight that most of us will never see. If Selina's story moved you, if it reminded you that resilience can rise from the darkest corners, then let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts, share where you're watching from, and tell us how her fight resonates with you. And as this story ends, new ones are waiting. Look to the screen. Other battles, other voices, other legends are ready to meet you there. Subscribe, stay with us, and keep riding through these stories that prove one truth again and again. Sometimes the strongest weapon in war is the human spirit that refuses to yield. Thank you for watching Veteran Biker. We'll see you in the next story.